Imagine a scenario that, well, probably feels a little too familiar right now. An economy is in just total free fall. Companies are dying off left and right. Mass layoffs are absolutely dominating the news cycle. Factories are just quietly shutting their doors. And there is this very real, palpable sense of collapse in the air.
Yeah, it's a grim picture.
Right. But then you take a peek at the financial reports of the few companies that somehow survived the slaughter,
Hmm.
and you spot something incredibly bizarre. The profit margins and the revenue productivity, which is basically how much money they make per employee, they look the best they ever have.
It creates this fascinating paradox, right? Because we see these businesses shrinking, they are bleeding staff, their overall physical output is just plummeting, and yet on paper they look exceptionally healthy, like incredibly profitable.
I remember looking at data during recent economic downturns and wondering that very thing. Like, why do surviving companies look incredibly profitable exactly at the moment they are shrinking? Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking a study from the National Bureau of Economic Research that, honestly, completely broke my brain.
It's a heavy hitter for sure.
Oh, absolutely. It was put together by a team of really top-tier economists, and they managed to get their hands on a database that most researchers would probably trade a kidney for. We are talking about tracking hundreds of thousands of Portuguese companies and millions of individual employees day by day, paycheck by paycheck, over a 10-year period from 1995 to 2005.
And the granularity of this data set is really what sets it apart. The researchers didn't just look at high-level revenues or quarterly earnings. They could literally see inside the very DNA of these corporate structures.
Like looking at the matrix.
Exactly. They knew exactly who was hired, who was let go, their specific job titles, their exact wages down to the cent. And crucially, they could separate how much physical stuff a factory was producing from how much money that factory was actually making.
And that distinction is going to be the key to this whole mystery. We are going to use this forensic data to decode the hidden structural rules that determine why some companies thrive and others just quietly die. And I will warn you right up front, some of the conclusions here are going to feel like a slap in the face.
Yeah, they really go against standard business logic.
Completely. We are going to explore why your company working harder might actually be making it poorer, why getting a promotion might secretly mean your underlying knowledge is worth less,
Yeah.
and why everything you and honestly I thought we knew about corporate growth and the corporate ladder is probably entirely backwards.
It demands a complete paradigm shift in how we view the workplace. I mean, we're so conditioned to evaluate businesses through the lens of their products or their marketing or, their brilliant CEO.
Right,
Yeah.
the visionary leader.
Exactly. But this data forces us to strip all of that away and look at business as an architectural problem. It is not about making a better widget. It is about the structural geometry of how you organize the human beings making the widget.
It's like looking at the source code of the economy for the very first time. We tend to think of business as this organic, creative endeavor, but this deep dive proves it is much closer to organizing a beehive based on strict mathematical laws. So, to understand this source code, we need to dismantle a very comforting myth most of us believe about our own workplaces. Think about the corporate ladder. When a company adds a layer of middle management, what is the standard justification?
Well, the standard narrative is that a company adds middle management to increase oversight and efficiency, right? We are told new managers are brought in to train the lower level workers to help them grow and to streamline operations.
Yeah, the idea is that they are there to help the frontline workers get better at their jobs. But the Portuguese data tells a completely different story, doesn't it?
It reveals a much colder structural truth. Companies do not add management layers to uplift the bottom. They add management layers to extract and concentrate knowledge at the top, which then allows them to cheapen the bottom.
Okay, wait, I need to pause you right there because that fundamentally challenges how we think about our careers.
Yeah.
You're saying that when my company hires a new director to sit above me, they aren't doing it to make my department smarter. They are doing it so they can eventually afford to hire people who know less than I do.
Let's place out on a factory floor. Imagine a manufacturing plant before any middle managers are hired. You have a team of frontline workers. Because there is no manager on the floor, these workers have to be highly knowledgeable.
Right, they are their own.
Exactly. If a complex machine jams or a highly customized order comes through with strange specifications, the workers have to figure it out themselves. There is no supervisor to escalate the issue to.
So the company has no choice but to hire highly skilled, experienced workers.
Yep.
And I'm assuming they have to pay a premium for that level of autonomy.
Right. You pay a premium for their problem-solving ability. But let's say the company decides to expand. They reorganize and bring in a layer of middle management. Suddenly, there is a boss whose explicit job description is to handle the unexpected. What the data shows is that over time, the firm inevitably begins replacing those highly paid, knowledgeable frontline workers with less knowledgeable and significantly cheaper
Yeah,
workers.
because the requirement to be a genius has been removed from the frontline job description.
Precisely. The new managers shoulder the burden of the complex problem solving. The firm essentially strips the required knowledge out of the frontline layer and concentrates it in the new management tier.
But surely that is just a theory. Like, does the data actually track individual wages falling when a boss is hired?
It explicitly tracks this. The researchers separated expanding firms into two categories. The first group consisted of firms that expanded their workforce but kept their management structure exactly the same. No new layers. For those firms, the wages of the pre-existing workers rose across the board. The frontline workers were taking on more responsibility, handling a larger volume of complex work, and the market compensated them for it.
Okay, that feels fair. You do more, you get paid more. What about the second group?
The second group consisted of firms that expanded and did add a new layer of management. In those specific instances, the average wage of the pre-existing lower layers fell.
That is wild. The company is essentially saying, we don't need you to be smart anymore. We just need you to be a pair of hands. We bought a brain, and it's sitting in the corner office.
Yeah, the new layer extracts the premium value of problem solving away from the bottom. You are no longer being paid for your ability to troubleshoot. You are just being paid to execute routine tasks. And because executing routine tasks requires less specialized knowledge, the labor market dictates that the company can hire cheaper labor to fill those roles.
So adding a management layer fundamentally rewires the human makeup of a company. You end up with a smarter, much more expensive top tier and a less knowledgeable, cheaper bottom tier. But that leads to an even bigger question. If you change the humans, what happens to the product? I mean, the moment the new boss walks in the door and reorganizes the floor, you would expect things to run better.
And they do, physically.
Right. But financially, they hit a wall. Let's dig into what the paper calls the curse of golden growth. Why does getting bigger and stronger trigger an instant drop in a company's ability to generate revenue per unit?
To understand this, we have to split productivity into two completely separate concepts. People, even business leaders, frequently conflate them. The first is physical productivity. Economists call this physical efficiency, just how much stuff you make, given the hours and materials you put in.
Okay, making stuff.
Yeah. The second is revenue productivity. This measures how much actual money you make relative to those same inputs.
Okay, so making stuff versus making money. Let me try to build out an analogy here. Let's say you own a small neighborhood bakery. You have a couple of bakers, you make 100 loaves of bread a day, and you sell them all for $5 each. Business is booming, so you decide to expand. You take out a loan, you buy a massive state-of-the-art industrial oven, and you hire a shift manager to organize a 24-hour baking cycle.
A classic expansion scenario.
Right. So suddenly, your physical efficiency is staggering. You are baking 1,000 loaves a day with barely any extra effort per loaf. Your physical productivity just shot through the roof. You are an absolute bread-making machine.
And if you stop your analysis there, you look like the most successful bakery in the city. But what happens when you open your doors the next morning?
That is the trap. You are still located in the exact same neighborhood. Your local market hasn't magically grown tenfold overnight just because you bought an oven and hired a manager. If you want to sell 1,000 loaves before they go stale by the end of the day, you cannot charge $5 anymore.
People just don't need that much bread.
Exactly. You had to put up a huge sign in the window saying, buy one, get 3 free, or bread for $1. So even though you are incredibly efficient at making the physical product, your revenue efficiency, how much money you make per unit of effort, looks terrible on your balance sheet.
The bakery analogy illustrates the Portuguese data perfectly. The deep dive reveals a stunning dual reality. The exact year a firm adds a layer of management, its physical productivity jumps by roughly 8%, the structural bottleneck is removed, and they just crank out volume. But in that exact same year, their revenue productivity instantly drops by 7%.
So you get better at making the thing, but worse at making money from the thing. And it's because organizational change is a blunt instrument. You didn't slowly ramp up from 100 loaves to 105 loaves to 110. You bought a massive oven and leaped to 1,000.
Companies do the exact same thing with their org charts. You cannot hire a tenth of a manager. You hire a whole manager. That single hire forces a massive leap in operational scale. You produce a mountain of new inventory, and to clear that inventory in the market, you have to slash your prices. The price drop destroys your revenue productivity.
I want to focus on that 8% physical jump for a second, though. I understand the price drop, but why does the addition of a manager trigger the physical explosion in the first place? I mean, a middle manager doesn't actually touch the product. They don't run the sewing machine, they don't pour the aluminum, they don't bake the bread. Why does putting a person in a suit on the factory floor increase the physical output by 8%?
It all comes down to how organizations manage ignorance.
Manage ignorance. Wow, that is a very provocative way to put it.
The researchers lean heavily on a framework called the Garicano model of knowledge hierarchies. It is a brilliant way to conceptualize what a company actually is. In this model, workers on the factory floor contribute one primary resource, time. Managers, on the other hand, contribute knowledge.
Okay, let's unpack that. If I'm a worker, I'm just selling my time.
Think about your daily routine. Every day, a frontline worker faces a series of tasks, or what the model calls problems. The vast majority of these problems are routine. If you work in a shoe factory, a routine problem is stitching the leather or attaching the sole. The worker uses their time to solve these routine problems and produce output. But occasionally, a rare, complex problem arises. The stitching machine jams in a way it never has before. A custom order comes in with weird instructions.
The unexpected stuff that just ruins your afternoon.
Exactly. Now, the company has a choice in how to handle that. They could pay every single frontline worker a massive salary to be a genius-level master mechanic and a master cobbler, ensuring that any worker could solve any conceivable problem themselves without stopping.
But that would bankrupt the company. You'd be paying an engineering salary to someone who spends 95% of their day just doing basic stitching. Most of that expensive genius brainpower would be totally wasted.
So instead of paying everyone to be a genius, they build a hierarchy. They hire cheaper workers who know exactly enough to handle the routine stuff. Let's say they can solve 80% of the daily problems. When a problem arises that falls into the 20% they do not know how to solve, they are explicitly instructed not to waste their time trying to figure it out. They immediately pass it up the chain to the manager.
They pass the ignorance upward.
The entire corporate hierarchy is just an elaborate filtering mechanism. It is designed to ensure that the most expensive problem solvers, the managers, only deal with the rarest, most difficult problems. The frontline worker is literally paid to know when to give up.
If we follow this logic all the way up the corporate ladder, I mean, a CEO is essentially the ultimate, I don't know what to do, trash can for the entire organization.
It's a humorous way to visualize it, but mathematically, yes. The CEO is the repository for the absolute rarest, most complex problems that have successfully passed through every single filter in the company without being solved.
This completely reframes how I view my own job. You always think your employer wants you to know everything. You feel bad when you have to ask a question. But you really aren't paid to know everything. You are paid to know exactly enough to handle the routine, and you are explicitly paid to surrender the things you don't know so you don't waste your time.
And this beautiful filtering system explains the 8% physical productivity explosion. When a company adds a management layer, they are installing a new, highly efficient filter. The frontline workers no longer have to stop the assembly line to scratch their heads over a broken machine. They instantly hand it off to the manager and go right back to cranking out the routine stuff. Their time is suddenly utilized much more efficiently because their ignorance is being managed perfectly.
It's an ignorance management system. I love that. But if this hierarchy is so perfectly mathematical, so elegant on paper, why is business so chaotic? Why don't companies just smoothly add a fraction of a manager whenever demand ticks up? Demand goes up 2%, just add 2% of a manager.
Because in the physical world, growth is painfully violent. As we touched on earlier, organizational architecture is inherently lumpy. You cannot hire half a manager. You cannot build a third of an HR department.
Which brings us to the agonizing pain of organizational jumps. Why do companies willingly endure cripplingly high costs and terrible inefficiencies, rather than just growing their headcount smoothly alongside demand?
Let's visualize what economists call a U-shaped average cost curve. Picture a graph. When a company is very small, the single boss at the top can handle everything. But as the company grows and hires more frontline workers, that solo boss's time becomes stretched to the absolute limit. They are working 100-hour weeks. They become the bottleneck. The average cost of producing a single unit actually starts going up because the whole system is straining under the biological limit of that one leader's time and attention.
I've seen founders go through this. They look exhausted, the company is chaotic, and everything takes twice as long to approve. So to grow beyond that bottleneck, you absolutely must add a whole new tier of middle management.
You must. But adding a layer of management means taking on a massive, fixed administrative cost all at once. You are committing to a whole new salary, healthcare benefits, office space, and the structural friction that comes with introducing a new boss to the floor. Because it's a massive fixed cost, you only take that leap if you believe the market demand is huge enough to absorb the new, massive volume you are about to produce.
You have to jump the chasm. You can't tiptoe across it.
You suffer the high costs of being strained, waiting until the pressure is so unbearable that it justifies the massive leap of hiring a whole new layer. The paper explores a fascinating hypothetical regarding this. The economist asked, what if we relax the laws of physics? What if we allowed a company to have an infinite number of CEOs at the top, or allowed them to fractionally scale a CEO's brain?
If you could just download 10% more CEO bandwidth.
If you could do that, the U-shaped cost curve would suddenly flatten out. Growth would be completely painless and linear. The only reason companies suffer these brutal growing pains is the literal biological limit of human bandwidth at the top. Human attention is finite, so corporate growth must be lumpy and violent.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on the theory, the cost curves, the knowledge filters. I want to see this violent, lumpy growth in action. Let's look at the actual forensic data of a real company from the Portuguese dataset. Let's talk about the restructuring of an anonymous aluminum cookware plant.
This is one of the most revealing case studies they uncovered. The researchers isolated a single product firm making aluminum pots and pans. They tracked its internal metrics meticulously between 1996 and 1999. During this window, the company hit a massive positive boom. Their exports skyrocketed by 170%.
Sales are absolutely through the roof. 170% increase in exports is a dream scenario. What did the company do in response?
They did what any rational company would do. They expanded, they grew their overall workforce by 27%, and to handle all these new people in this massive volume, they added a third layer of management. They transitioned from a 2-layer organization to a 3-layer organization.
And what did the financial and production data show in the exact year they made that jump?
It is a perfect real-world visualization of our theory. In the exact year they added that third layer, you look at their physical efficiency chart and the line shoots straight up. They became absolute machines at producing aluminum pots. But immediately, in that exact same year, the price line on their chart dives straight down.
It's mind-blowing to think about this from the perspective of an outsider. If you were a business journalist looking at their sales volume, you'd write a glowing feature article calling them a massive success story. Local plant increases exports by 170%. But if you looked at their unit pricing and their revenue productivity, the actual profit made per unit of input, you'd assume they were in deep trouble. The price they could command in the market crashed because their massive new physical efficiency flooded the market with pots.
It proves that success and failure in a corporate expansion are entirely dependent on which metric you are focusing on. They achieved the physical explosion the Garicano knowledge model predicts, but they suffered the exact price collapse that the lumpy cost curve dictates.
Now, this aluminum plant grew because of a positive shock. They had a surge in exports, so they chose to expand. But what happens when the shock isn't positive? What happens when a terrifying external threat forces a company to shrink against its will? Expanding is one thing, but contracting, that's where things get really painful. Let's look at a historical event that rocked the global economy. How did a factory 10,000 miles away in China instantly decide the fate of middle managers in Portugal?
To truly test this theory of management layers, the researchers needed what they call an exogenous shock. They needed an unpredictable, massive external event that nobody in Portugal saw coming, something completely outside the control of these local factory owners. And they found the perfect historical moment. In 2001, China formally entered the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
A watershed moment for global trade.
It changed everything. For the European Union, China's entry meant that strict quotas on textiles imported from China were suddenly removed. The floodgates opened. For certain sub-industries in textiles, this resulted in an astonishing 240% explosion of cheap Chinese imports flooding the European market.
A 240% increase in competition overnight. That is Apocalyptic for a local manufacturer.
It was a catastrophic loss of demand for Portuguese textile firms. And this is vital for the economist research because it allows them to study companies that were violently forced to shrink. Think back to our knowledge filter. When your demand evaporates overnight, the massive physical volume you use to produce vanishes. And if the volume vanishes, the mathematical justification for that bulky, expensive management hierarchy vanishes with it.
Because you don't need an expensive filter to manage rare problems if the assembly line isn't moving. You aren't making anything.
Exactly. These Portuguese companies were forced into passive, violent restructuring. They didn't choose to reorganize. The global market held a gun to their head. It was either shed the management layers or die.
I want to zoom in on one specific factory that took this WTO punch directly to the face. The researchers documented the high premium in mass layoffs. We're looking at a knitwear factory. Imagine firing 70% of your staff, sacking your managers, and watching your physical production volume get cut in half. Why in the world would your revenue productivity suddenly rise by 9.2%?
This is a case study of a firm making knitted pullovers. Between 2002 and 2005, this specific sweater factory was absolutely crushed by the Chinese quota removals. They had to take drastic survival action. They dropped from 37 employees down to just 10. And structurally, they dropped from 3 management layers down to 2.
They amputated. Who did they actually fire? Did they just fire the lowest paid people?
You might assume that, but the forensic data shows exactly who got the axe, and it was the middle. They fired the production managers. They fired the sales managers. They fired the fiber preparers, the pattern makers, even the single designer they had on staff. They stripped away everything that wasn't absolutely essential to the physical creation of the garment. They retreated to a tiny, highly defensive posture, keeping only their core group of frontline sewers and embroiderers.
They shed the massive fixed cost of that top layer. What happened to their numbers?
As you would expect, their physical output crashed by 53%. They were a shadow of their former selves. But because they had shed all that expensive management overhead, and because they were now a tiny, hyper-focused unit selling much lower volumes, they didn't have to deeply discount their sweaters to move massive inventory. Their prices actually rebounded by 30%. And as a mathematical result, their financial profitability metrics, their revenue productivity went up by 9.2%.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing this correctly. You're telling me that a company looks healthier on a financial spreadsheet specifically because it slaughtered its own management structure and halved its output?
Yes. From a revenue productivity standpoint, the violent shrinkage saved them. By retreating back up that U-shaped cost curve and dropping a layer, they aligned their organization perfectly with their new, smaller reality. And here is the truly fascinating part for the workers who survived. The median wages for the frontline sewers who stayed actually went up.
Wait, they're in the middle of a corporate apocalypse. The company is fighting for its life. Why would anyone get a raise?
Think back to the Garicano model. The company fired the managers. Without the managers there to filter the problems, the frontline sewers suddenly had to handle the complex, rare problems again. If a machine broke, they had to fix it themselves. Their required knowledge level went back up. They reclaimed the problem-solving value, and the company had to compensate them for it.
Wow. The seesaw swings back. When the company grew, it bought a brain at the top, and the hands at the bottom got dumber and cheaper. Now the company shrinks, it loses the brain at the top, so the hands at the bottom have to get smarter, and they get paid more. That is staggering. But another textile giant took an even more drastic approach to survive this Chinese influx. They didn't just cut people, they cut off their own limbs.
Let's look at a larger firm making woven fabrics. Faced with the same WTO shock, they shrank their workforce by 46% and dropped from 3 management layers to 2. But they went a step further than the sweater factory. They didn't just shrink their headcount, they pruned their entire product line.
They abandoned whole branches of their business.
They completely abandoned producing synthetic fabrics. They looked at the market and realized, we can't compete with China on synthetics, so we are going to double down on our core competency, high-quality cotton. So they fired the steam engine operators, they fired the bleached fabric workers, and at the top of the pyramid, they completely eliminated their specialized team of 3 accounting managers. They replaced that entire top tier of management with a couple of basic administrative secretaries.
This is the ultimate circling the wagons maneuver. Pull everything in, defend the core, and survive.
And the math played out perfectly again. Physical output dropped 19%. But because they were producing less volume and focusing purely on high-quality cotton, their prices rose 13%. Their revenue productivity skyrocketed by an astonishing 30%. And again, the workers who survived on layer 0 saw their median wages go up by 7.5%.
So by amputating half the business, dropping a management layer, and forcing the remaining frontline workers to take on more complex responsibility, the company's revenue efficiency exploded. It's brutal, but mathematically beautiful. I'm starting to see the pattern. But we need to know if this is just a textile thing. Is this just a quirk of sweaters and cotton in the early 2000s? Does this hold up across totally different industries?
The researchers looked across the entire manufacturing sector to prove this wasn't an isolated quirk. The brutal math of expansion and contraction appears to be universal.
Let's look at two totally different factories moving in opposite directions. A tale of hot and cold extremes. Shoes versus cork. Why did an expanding, highly successful cork factory actively cut the wages of its original workers, while a failing shoe factory gave its workers a raise?
This comparison is the perfect summary of the opposing forces we've been discussing. Let's look at the shoe factory first. They hit a downturn in the market, they downsized, dropping a management layer and firing a finance clerk.
Right.
The result? Exactly what we saw in textiles. They produced less physical volume, so their prices rose by 12%, and the surviving frontline shoemakers got a pay bump because they had to take on more problem-solving responsibility without the manager.
The classic contraction response. You shrink the org chart, prices stabilize, surviving workers get smarter and richer. Now, contrast that with the cork factory. Portugal is massive in global cork production.
Right, this cork factory hit a positive boom, global demand was up, so they expanded from one management layer to two. They hired 2 new production managers to oversee the floor. They increased their frontline wood treaters from 8 people to 9.
So they are growing. They are hiring. It sounds like a fantastic, healthy place to work.
It sounds great until you look closely at the numbers. Because they added the new managers, their physical efficiency went up 6%. They were cranking out cork. But to sell all that new cork they were efficiently producing, they had to slash their prices by 6%. Their revenue productivity collapsed by 29%.
Yeah.
The most painful part, the median wages of the frontline wood treaters dropped by 7%.
It violates everything we are taught about business success. You would think a booming, expanding company pays its people better. But shrink your company. Prices go up, revenue productivity goes up, and existing worker pay goes up. Grow your company. Prices drop, revenue productivity drops, and existing worker pay drops.
You would intuitively think growth equals higher wages, but the Garicano model proves why it doesn't. The booming cork factory added a brain to the operation, the 2 new managers. They extracted the problem-solving value from the wood treaters. The wood treaters' knowledge was no longer needed to solve complex problems, so their wages were adjusted downward by the market to match their new, simpler reality.
Okay, my mind is thoroughly blown by these case studies. But I want to put my skeptic hat on for a moment. If I'm a rival economist reading this paper, I might say, these are great narratives, the shoe factory, the cord factory, the aluminum plant. But stories aren't proof. How do we know this isn't just a coincidence? How do we know the management change caused the productivity shift? Maybe the company expected a drop in prices, so they hired a manager to deal with it.
That is the exact hurdle the NBER economists had to clear. Anecdotes make for great deep dives, but to publish in top economic journals, you cannot rely on narratives. You have to prove causality mathematically. You have to crack the black box of corporate data.
Which brings us to the holy grail of economic research, proving causality. If a company reorganizes because they expect future profits, how can you prove the reorganization caused the productivity change?
This is where the researchers brought out the heavy artillery. They utilized a brilliant, highly complex mathematical method, which the paper refers to as the Malama method.
I am going to need you to explain this method to me as if I am 5 years old without giving me a math headache. We promised no academic jargon.
Fair enough. Let's go back to your bakery. You look at your bakery's bank account at the end of the year, and your revenue is up 20%. That's your raw data. Now, as the owner, you want to know why it's up. Did you get better at baking? Did you add a new manager who made the ovens run faster? Or did a trendy new gym open next door, causing a sudden spike in demand for carb loading? Or maybe flour got cheaper, so your markup naturally increased.
Right. When I just look at the bank account, All those factors demand shocks, markup changes, actual physical efficiency are tangled together in a giant knot. I don't know which thread is pulling the hardest.
Exactly. In normal financial data, those things are all tangled together in a black box. You can't tell them apart. This mathematical method is designed to systematically strip away the noise.
How does it do that?
It uses a two-stage process. First, it looks at the broader market data to estimate the demand shocks. It mathematically isolates the new gym opening next door effect. Then it looks at the cost of inputs to isolate the changes in markup. It washes all of that external noise away so that what you are left with is the pure, unadulterated measure of physical productivity, the true underlying efficiency of the factory floor. By applying this, the researchers proved that the 8% jump in physical productivity we see when a layer is added isn't just a side effect of a lucky demand wave or a change in material costs. It is a real structural efficiency gain caused by the reorganization.
I understand separating the tangled threads, and that is brilliant, but I'm going to push back here again. You've isolated the physical productivity, but how do you prove the arrow of time? How do you prove that the management change actually triggered the efficiency gain? What if a sudden burst of efficiency convinced the boss, hey, we're doing great, let's hire a manager to keep this going?
You're hitting on a core problem. Did the chicken cause the egg or the egg cause the chicken? To prove ultimate, hardcore causality, to prove the arrow of time only points one way, the researchers couldn't just look at what the companies did internally. Internal decisions are always tainted by human bias and expectations. They needed a stress test from the outside. They used what economists call instrumental variables.
The currency stress test. How does a tiny fluctuation in the value of foreign currency serve as the ultimate bulletproof evidence of how corporate hierarchies work? What even is an instrumental variable?
It's a tool researchers use when they want to poke a system with a stick to see how it reacts, but they need to make sure the stick is completely unrelated to the system itself. Imagine you want to study if a police presence lowers crime. You look at data and see a lot of police in high-crime areas. Did the police cause the crime? No, the crime caused the police to be there.
So how do you untangle that?
You find an instrument. You find a day where it's raining heavily. Rain is random. It has nothing to do with crime policy. But rain forces criminals to stay indoors. If crime drops on rainy days, you can isolate the true effect of taking criminals off the street. Rain is the instrumental variable.
Okay, I follow the rain analogy. So what was the rain for these Portuguese factories?
The researchers looked at the exchange rate shocks between Portugal and the specific countries these firms exported to or imported from. Why exchange rates? Because the exchange rate between the euro and the US dollar or the British pound is entirely outside the control of a Portuguese factory manager making aluminum pots.
It's an act of God, essentially. The factory owner can't influence the global currency market.
It is a completely random external shock to demand or costs. If the currency fluctuates favorably, it makes Portuguese goods slightly cheaper abroad, acting as a random positive shock. If it fluctuates poorly, it's a random negative shock.
So they use the international currency markets to randomly poke these companies with a stick.
Yes. And what the data proves is that when these random, unpredictable currency shocks push a firm just over a specific threshold of demand, they are forced to add or drop a management layer. The shock happens first, entirely outside their control. It hits the firm, pushes them over the edge, they change the layer, and then the ensuing productivity chaos, the 8% jump in physical output and the 7% drop in revenue productivity happens. It is purely causal.
That is the hardcore self-proof. They washed away all the internal biases, all that maybe the manager was just feeling optimistic noise. The inverse relationship between management layers and the two faces of productivity is an absolute, undeniable physical law of economics.
It happens every time, whether you make sweaters, pots, shoes, or cork.
But wait, I'm looking at my notes here, and there is a mystery hidden inside this currency data. Let's talk about the price transmission mystery. Why does a tiny ripple in the international exchange rate turn into a tsunami by the time it hits the price tag of a Portuguese product?
This is what economists call price pass-through. Normally, if your costs go up slightly, say, the price of flour goes up 2%, you raise the price of your bread by roughly 2%. The pass-through is proportional. But the researchers found something terrifying in the data. Conditional on reorganization, the price change is incredibly violent. The pass-through rate is often much greater than 1.
Meaning a tiny 1% shift in currency can result in a 3 or 4% shift in the price of the final product. How is that possible?
It happens because of the tipping point we talked about earlier. Remember the lumpy U-shaped cost curve?
Right, you can't hire half a manager. You hold off as long as possible.
Exactly. A firm might be operating right at the absolute limit of its current management structure. The boss is stretched to the breaking point, but they haven't pulled the trigger on hiring a new manager because it's too expensive. Then, a tiny random currency shock hits. The currency shifts by 1%. That tiny 1% is the straw that breaks the camel's back.
It forces their hand. They finally have to hire the manager.
It forces the firm to finally add that bulky, lumpy management layer. But once that layer is added, the entire fundamental scale of the company shifts. They don't just increase their physical output by 1% to match the currency shock. They have a whole new manager to pay. They have a whole new capacity for problem solving. So they increase physical output massively to justify the new salary. And to clear all that new inventory, they have to drop their prices violently. So a 1% external shock triggered a massive internal reorganization, which caused a massive outsized change to the final product price.
So these companies are like coiled springs. They're building up all this structural tension, and the currency market just nudges the release catch. The whole architecture of the company explodes into a new shape, taking the prices with it.
That is a perfect visualization. The organization changes its shape, and the economics of the product warp to fit the new container. And this brings us to the most staggering statistic in the entire deep dive: the true macroeconomic weight of middle management.
Let's play a game. If you were an all-powerful dictator of a country, and you passed a law tomorrow that made it illegal for companies to reorganize their management layers, like they can hire as many frontline workers as they want, but they cannot add or remove middle managers, how much of a country's economic growth would vanish?
You lose all of it.
All of it.
Yeah.
That can't be right. What about technological innovation? What about working harder?
The data is incredibly explicit on this point. The researchers isolated the reorganization effect in the math. They found that for expanding and downsizing firms, the act of adding or dropping layers accounts for more than 100% of the average physical productivity changes.
I'm not a math genius, but how can something account for more than 100% of a change?
Because without reorganization, the natural friction and inefficiencies of growth would actually drag productivity backward. If a company just tried to hire more and more frontline workers without adding management layers to filter the knowledge and solve the complex problems, the chaos and inefficiency would drown out any gains. The workers would be constantly stuck, machines would stay broken longer, and the average cost would just keep climbing. The act of changing the org chart, of adding those knowledge filters, is the literal engine of all economic progress. It overcomes the drag of friction.
Let me reframe this as a biological limit.
Yeah.
Think about a single-cell organism. It can only get so big before it just bursts. The physics of its surface area to volume ratio won't allow it to grow any larger. If you want to become a whale, you don't just get a bigger and bigger single cell. You have to invent complex organs. You need a heart to pump blood, lungs to process oxygen, a nervous system to coordinate it all. Management layers are the organs of the economy. Without the ability to evolve new organs, growth hits a total biological dead end.
That is exactly right. A mom-and-pop shop is a single-cell organism. A multinational corporation is a whale. And the management layers are the nervous system that filters the signals from the extremities to the brain.
This biological limit explains a really tragic reality for millions of businesses around the world today. Why do companies in many developing countries seemingly never grow up? When you look at economic data from certain nations, you see an ocean of tiny, inefficient mom-and-pop shops that never scale. Why are they prisoners of a mediocre empire?
The deep dive connects us directly to global macroeconomics. We just established that to grow, you must add layers. But adding layers is a massive investment, and more importantly, it requires trust and a functional environment. In many developing nations, the environment makes it incredibly risky or costly to add a management layer.
Why is it riskier to hire a manager there than in Portugal or the US?
Think about the friction in the surrounding society. If you live in an economy with weak rule of law, you might not be able to trust middle managers not to embezzle from you. If labor contracts are extremely rigid or heavily unionized, you might not be able to fire a manager if they turn out to be terrible at their job. Or if corruption is high, the fixed cost of adding a new department might include massive bribes to local officials just to get the permits to expand.
So that U-shaped cost curve we talked about, the gap you have to jump to reach the next level of efficiency is just too wide. The fixed cost, when you add in corruption and risk, becomes insurmountable.
Exactly. Because these firms cannot risk building the knowledge hierarchy, they can never unlock that 8% physical productivity explosion. They are terrified to add the new manager, so the founder just stays stretched to the limit. The company stays small, they stay inefficient, and as a result, their entire national economy remains trapped in mediocrity. They are single-cell organisms living in a toxic environment that makes it fatal to evolve organs.
That is devastating. The structural inability to just hire a boss securely prevents an entire country from becoming wealthy. It all comes back to the Garicano model. The architecture of human knowledge dictates the wealth of nations.
The entire trajectory of global capitalism distilled down to the shape of the org chart.
Okay, we're coming to the end of this deep dive, but I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. We've spent this entire time unpacking the judgment of a past era. We've looked at this mathematical law of management layers through the lens of Portuguese data from the 1990s and 2000s. But let's fast forward to today. Let's look at your desk right now.
The core premise of the Garicano model is that management layers exist purely to filter knowledge. They exist to handle the complex, rare problems that the frontline workers do not have the time or the knowledge to solve.
But what happens when you introduce artificial intelligence into that equation? Imagine an AI tool is placed directly in the hands of the frontline worker. A sewer on the factory floor, a junior coder, or an entry-level analyst suddenly has instant localized access to top-tier CEO-level problem-solving knowledge right in their pocket. If a machine breaks, the AI tells the worker exactly how to fix it in seconds. If a weird custom order comes in, the AI generates the perfect code to handle it. If the frontline worker never has to pass a problem up the chain, the entire mathematical justification for the middle management layer evaporates.
It absolutely destroys the premise of the Garicano hierarchy. If the bottom layer possesses the knowledge of the top layer, the filters in the middle are completely obsolete. The company is paying for a brain they no longer need.
So here's the burning question I want you to chew on. If AI destroys the middle layers of our modern corporations, do we experience the greatest explosion of physical productivity in human history because we bypass the lumpy, massive fixed costs of middle management? And do we achieve this without the traditional wage drops because the frontline workers, technically highly knowledgeable again thanks to their AI co-pilot?
Or does bypassing the human filter break the fundamental architecture of how companies value human time? If everyone has a CEO's brain in their pocket, maybe knowledge itself loses its premium value entirely, leading to a total structural collapse of how we calculate wages.
The Portuguese data from the 90s holds the DNA of how we organize human effort. But AI is about to rewrite the code entirely. We are entering uncharted territory. We started this deep dive looking at an economy in total freefall, where the companies that survived looked profitable precisely because they violently shrank and amputated their management layers. It makes you wonder, as AI begins to strip the layers out of our modern corporations, are we looking at a glorious renaissance of frontline empowerment, or are we just staring down the barrel of the most violent passive restructuring in the history of the world? It is something for you to mull over the next time you look at your company's org chart, look up at your boss, and wonder what exactly it is you are being paid to not know. That's our deep dive for today.